Okay, thank you everyone for coming. So this is the final closeout public meeting for the resurvey of the local historic district for Ypsilanti. And I am Carrie Mollis. I'm the new preservation planner for the city as of last month. And previously, Ellen Thackeray was in this position, and she was a huge part of making this project possible and drafting the grant application, working with SHPO. We have Katie Kolakithis from SHPO. She's a survey coordinator. And we also have the contractors who completed the work with us. So that's Vinewood Planning and Preservation and Planning. Um, did I mess that up? Okay.
Close enough.
But I'll let them introduce themselves in just a minute. But I wanted to briefly talk about the survey in the background. It's been completed over about a year timeline. We're going to be ending August 2025. The purpose of a survey, which they're really going to dive into, but it's such an important part of planning for historic resources within, well, anywhere, but within our city. It's a really important step to be able to do other projects. So this really is a maintenance thing that hasn't been done since the 1980s. So 1983 was the last survey. And best practices trying to keep that survey as current as possible so that we have a working knowledge of what is, a snapshot of what's going on within the historic district. And that enables our historic district commission to make better decisions, more informed decisions. It makes everything run a lot smoother, a lot more efficiently. And that, of course, adds to our record. And there are just so many benefits. And it's also a requirement, too, as a certified local government, which is a program that SHPO oversees, but it allows us to receive grants, such as the one that funded this resurvey. So that grant is through the National Park Service, but it's overseen by the states. So it's I feel very fortunate to be coming into this position with this being just completed. It's kind of a dream for a preservation planner because there are just so many things that can now be done and it opens up so many possibilities. So I'm very grateful to Ellen Thackeray and to, of course, all the people before her, even the prior preservation planner, Scott Slager, who's now working with the State Historic Preservation Office. He identified this as something that needs to happen too. So it's been a slow process over several years, and now we're finally arriving to the point where this is completed. And we'll get into the point of today's discussion is to really look at the findings and recommendations of the resurvey. And Tim and Michael are going to be covering all of the findings, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. And because it's a recorded session, I know I have at least one person online that's tuned in, but it'll be made available to the public. I'll keep it posted on the Historic District webpage for at least a year, for a while, so it's accessible for people to understand, get an overview of the findings and recommendations. But additionally, it's my goal to make sure that because one of the deliverables of this resurvey is a individual property identification form that looks at, each property gets a summary of its current state and its history, and that I want to make it accessible to owners and residents. And I'll be working out how to post that on our website so that the public has access, and as well as the survey report. So it'll be a great addition, a great resource that we have not had access to in a long time. So I'm very excited. And again, I just want to acknowledge SHPO's involvement. I've worked with Katie on other projects, and I know she's wonderful. She's the one who helped to draft the latest above ground survey manual. So that's the uh, basically what everyone who is doing a resurvey project, that's what they're following. And it's been updated. It was updated in 2018, I believe. And so it's nice to just be working with recent guidance and nice to know that this work is aligned with all the updates to the guidance as well. So I'm not going to go on and on, but I just wanted to give you a brief background of the project, and then I'm going to hand it over to Tim and Michael. And then when we get into questions, because the meeting's being recorded, if you do have a question, I'll just ask you to come up to the mic. And if you're online, if you can use the raise hand function on Zoom, and I'll monitor that so I can make sure to get to your question. But that's a large part of today. The point of today's discussion too is to try to field some feedback from the community. And this will be an ongoing process too. Whatever, the survey is really a report and a snapshot. And the work, all the decisions that are going to be based on this come after. So there will be a continuation of conversation and involvement with the community. And if you're interested in being updated individually, you can always sign up with your email, and I'll make sure to send out updates relevant to what the city does with this information. So thank you all for attending. I'm really excited to listen to their presentation, and I've read through the report. I think there's a lot of great recommendations. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Vinewood.
Thank you. So I'm Tim. Thank you very much. This is Michael. Thanks for coming, everyone. We are Vinewood Preservation Planning, and we've been hired by the city of Ypsilanti to do an updated historic resource survey of the Ypsilanti Historic District. Like Carrie said, the last one was done in 1983, and some time has passed since then, so it's time to do a new one. Last time this group met was in July 2024 around the start of the project, so about a year ago. And we had to talk about why a survey was needed and what we will be doing over the course of the next year. And now that that year has happened, I'm kind of summarize, summarize what we talked about a year ago, since it was a year ago, and then Michael will talk about what all we did with our work and what our findings were. So could I get the first slide, please? So let me start with what is a historic district in the first place? I think you all know, but it can't hurt to have a little, reminder. A historic district, of course, is a place that is old and that has an interesting and an important history. But when we say, something is a historic district, what we really mean is it is a place that the local government, which in this place is the Ypsilanti and its city council, has decided, like, okay, this is going to be a historic district. That district gets established or designated, or whatever word you want to use. And that means the local government creates the historic district. And within those boundaries, and you see the historic district shown on the screen here, within those boundaries, the Historic District Commission has authority over any changes that get made to buildings or outdoor spaces or anything like that. It also means there's a state tax credit that some property owners are able to take advantage of if they're doing a rehab of the building. There's a couple other minor implications, but mainly those two things are what a historic district means. It means there's that review from the commission, and it means there's a state tax credit. Now, that being said, we all know what a historic district is. There is one sort of confusing thing that I'm going to get into. For the most part, when we're talking about the district, we're talking about the district created by the Ypsilanti City Council. There is this other thing called the National Register of Historic Places, which is a federal program. The National Register also has something called the Ypsilanti Historic District. That's not really what we're talking about. We do go into that a little bit, but for the most part, we're talking about the district created by the city of Ypsilanti. And, it's those boundaries there. The National Register listing has different boundaries, and that's just not primarily what we're talking about. Although some of our recommendations actually do involve bringing those two different things more into harmony. So can I get the next slide, please? So just mention what a a historic district is. Now, what is a survey? So now that I explained what a historic district is, a survey is um, survey refers to the process of identifying and gathering data on a community's historic resources, and that is how it's defined by the State Historic Preservation Office in the 2018 manual that Carrie just mentioned. A survey is a useful tool for planning and decision making. Any kind of planning the city and the community has to do, it's a good tool. Um, it is required when a historic district is first established. So one was done a long time ago when the historic district was first made in 1978. Um, and it is also required to be redone once in a while in order to maintain Ypsilanti's certified local government status. So by redoing the survey, we're helping Ypsilanti to keep that status that allows it to apply for certain federal grants from the Historic Preservation Fund. So the next one, please. So why do we need a survey? Carrie already kind of mentioned this, but it helps the Historic District Commission to make decisions. They're looking at a building and they have more information on why it's important, what its important features are, that sort of thing. It provides photos, description, history of each property, which again is very useful. And it helps determine what are contributing buildings. And contributing is kind of a technical word. You could also just say historic buildings. In a historic district, there are contributing buildings and non-contributing buildings. You could also say historic buildings and non-historic buildings or structures or resources, whatever the case is. The contributing ones are the ones that get a higher level of overview from the commission and the ones that are eligible for that tax credit. Another reason for doing a survey, it's just interesting to have all this information about your town. I mean, we're historians. We just, like this kind of stuff. So could I get the next slide, please? So the Ypsilanti Historic District, like I said, it was first enacted by the city council or designated in 1978 after, I guess you could call it a survey. There was a report written at the time that looked into the historic significance of the district. And there were surveys of one form or another done in 1972, which would have been prior to the district, 1978, and 1983. And the 1983 one is kind of the only one that really truly is a survey, and that it went into the level of looking at individual buildings and talking about why they're important and so on. So that's the one we based ours on. And that's why we call it a resurvey project, because there was a survey done in 1983. We're doing a resurvey, kind of an update of that work. So next slide, please. Our actual survey which, like I said, we're a year into it. It's 95% complete at this time, probably 99% complete, but it consists of two parts. The first part is a report that goes into the history of the district, and we have it organized like the state tells us to by theme. And the themes we found were 19th century and pre-war architecture, modern architecture, landscape architecture. It's the first three, kind of all architecture. And then exploration, settlement, and social history, commerce and industry, the Second World War and post-war social history, government, and African American heritage. And of all those themes, the architecture ones are probably the most important because they're the ones that sort of have the most impact on what the building looks like and how it gets regulated and so on. But we use those themes to determine a period of significance. And then we use the period of significance to determine this list of what we call contributing resources, but that basically means historic resources, the buildings, the bridges, the parks, those sorts of things within the district that are historically significant. And for the second part, the identification forms, we walked around the city a whole lot, took a lot of notes and pictures, and then prepared a form for each building. Might be one page, might be two for some of the more interesting, more complicated buildings. That basically just tells you about the history of that building and why it's historic or not historic, and what its important features are that ought to be preserved going forward. So I talked about what we just did, bringing up to speed, and Michael's going to talk about our actual, what we found and our recommendations.
Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Michael. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a little bit about, actually, I'd first like to talk about some of the changes since the 83 survey, since this is a resurvey. And then I'll go into some of our recommendations of based off of what we surveyed, what we found. The first thing I'd like to talk about the 83 survey is some of the limitations of the 83 survey. So although this is a resurvey, in some ways there are some difficulties in comparing what we found now to the 83 survey because of Well, first of all, they had no comprehensive list of whether a building was contributing or not. They had individual survey forms, but the problems with those individual survey forms is that they're all physical copies, and some went missing over the past 40 years. But more importantly, that survey also just did not survey certain streets. A lot of the west side, east-west streets, they did not survey, and actually have a picture of 313 Olive Street, a house. And that one was just, to my knowledge, never surveyed, and as along with the rest of Olive Street, Emmett, Catherine, a few streets like that. And then a lot of the historic East Side, so Maple Street, Oak Street, did not have individual survey forms made either. So given that, yeah, it's a little tough to compare because of the limitations of the 83 survey. And I actually have just an example of the survey forms back then, and then I want to show you our new survey forms as well. So it's going to be kind of hard to see from the viewers here, but the original survey forms were just one page, and they had very little information on them. They do talk about wall material and roof material, but besides that, they don't give much information about how the house was constructed. They do have, in theory, a date of construction. However, I think only maybe 20 of the sheets I found actually had the dates listed, some of which were incorrect. And sometimes they talk about condition and structural kind of the quality of the building they would use. But generally those portions were only filled out for the kind of the finest, biggest buildings of the city. So most of those were not filled out. There's also some errors on this form, which you can't really see. That house is identified as a Second Empire style house, which is incorrect. And I like some city planner of past years wrote in, no, this is not correct. So I had a few forms like that where you'd have little in the margins, city planners would be like, no, this is actually what it is. So some limitations. If you want to go to the next slide, these are the new survey forms that we filled out. This is the first page of one. So we have a bit more, again, kind of hard for you to see in the audience here, but more on the different materials that are used, like window material, roofing material, foundation material, things like that. Talking about outbuildings also. We did any building or structure on the property that was of significant size. We did survey as well. We weren't allowed to go on people's property, so oftentimes that was limited by what we could see from the street or alleys, but we did our best we could there. A little bit about the history, and then there's the different types of integrity the building held, going by the National Register guidelines, basically, for that. You want to go to the next page? And then all the forms also have a narrative architectural description, so description of what the building looks like and some of the salient features of it. A brief history of the resource. This was a reconnaissance level survey, so most of the data we gathered, we did some historical research, of course, especially looking at old fire insurance maps to see how buildings changed over time. But most of it was us just walking to the buildings, looking at them, taking photos, and documenting that way. So there isn't that much on the history sections for the most of them, but there is always a little bit there. And then the next section is the statement of significance and eligibility. This is basically where we justify why we think this building is contributing to the district or non-contributing. And then if it's very special, if it's eligible for nomination on the National Register. So some of the actual changes. There was some loss of resources, although over the last 40 years, there really aren't that many of them. They're mostly in two areas around the Ypsilanti Transit Center. That's 220 Pearl Street. Large parking lot there. There were some buildings there, and kind of kitty corner there, what's now 300 West Michigan, the large office building and parking structure there. It used to be the EMU's Business College, I believe, built in 1991. And there used to be a few buildings along on Pearl Street there that were demolished to build that. And then, as you see in the photo here, this is the Water Street redevelopment area, so the south side of East Michigan Avenue. At the time of the 1983 survey, there were still commercial buildings there, and those have since been demolished. Some buildings have lost integrity, which you would consider, they were contributing before and now are non-contributing. Those are very, very few. I think there might only be two that I know of. Now, I don't have the full, because of the limitations of the 83 survey, we don't know exactly everything was contributing. But of those we did know, I think only two kind of lost that contributing status. And this is just one example of the much more common are buildings that have been rehabilitated in some way that either stay contributing or are went from non-contributing to contributing. And this is just one example. This is, what is this, 213 West Forest Avenue, where you have a building, it was clad in asbestos siding in when it was surveyed in 83. And that would have been, so 81, 82 was when they did the actual groundwork of that survey. And then that siding has been removed. So now it has revealed the original wood clapboard siding. And also you can see new details, or rather I should say old details, original details, like the window surrounds, the hoods above them are visible now. To give a little bit of context too, for the kind of the changes that had happened in the late 70s is when there was the Tax Reform Act of 1976, and that was the nation's first tax credit for historic rehabilitation. And that encouraged rehabilitation projects. And really, it was in the 70s where this kind of new historic preservation mentality was starting. So 83 is really kind of the beginning of that period. And so now 40 years later, you can kind of see, the fruits of, those changes. The biggest area that has of rehabilitation, I would say, you can go to the next slide, would be the downtown area. Many of the buildings there, mostly built in the 19th century, were rehabilitated to look much more like they originally did. This is 110 West Michigan. And after World War II, so late 40s, 1950s, 1960s, what happened was a lot of these had false front facades put on, basically new facades, metal enamel paneling, like in this picture. So you can have a big display of the business name, and that obscures, of course, all the windows that are underneath it, or sometimes metal grills as well. Now, if you're a longtime resident of Ypsilanti, you have seen this process happen before your eyes, right? But if you're a new resident, then you might not know that, a lot of these, maybe not most, but a lot of them did have these facades, and most of them now have been taken down. I think there's only 4 buildings that still have the full facade that remain. And so this is 110 West Michigan now. So much more closer to what it originally looked like, Italianate in style. It has the nice decorative window hoods above them and the brick corbelling at the top. And then you can go to the next picture. And this is just another example, 116 West Michigan. And this is an example of a non-contributing building. You can't really see it's hard to see, but it was considered non-contributing. It's just the metal sheet, basically, and just this kind of brick. And so this is it now. So it's actually the building on the right, the brick building on the right. And it has the putting up of those facades oftentimes did damage to the building. And so some of the window lintels have been redone, but it still has its historic fenestration pattern. It still uses a lot of the original face brick. So this is now a building that we would consider contributing. The one next to it with the Gothic arched windows is another example that was covered up. I could not find the original survey sheet for that one. But it would be another example that was totally covered and now revealing something. And that's actually it's rare to have a Gothic revival commercial buildings like that. That one's a neat one. Can go to the next slide, please. New uses, just briefly, new uses of older buildings. This was built as the Masonic Hall, and in 83 it was still used by Masonic groups. It then became a warehouse for Materials Unlimited for some time, and now is the Riverside Arts Center. So there's a few examples of that, especially larger buildings throughout the city. And then residential rehabilitation. I already showed you one picture, but here's another example of a Greek revival house, 320 East Cross Street. 83, it was clad in aluminum siding. It had very ahistorical shutters on it. Also some simulated masonry brick applique in the front there. And that has been, taken off, now revealing wood clapboard siding. And then the next one, please. Another example, 505 North Hamilton Street. Queen Anne style house, asbestos siding has been removed to reveal, again, the wood clapboard siding. And in this case, so that porch that you see now is actually brand new. Well, not exactly necessarily brand new, but it is not the original porch, right? But it is something that is much more in line with its actual style. So it makes sense historically to have, those kind of columns and things like that. That works with the Queen Anne style. And the last thing biggest thing we found while doing the survey is just the continued maintenance of so many buildings. Anybody who owns an old home knows this is not an easy thing. It is expensive. It is time consuming. So to see that many buildings that have been continuously maintained has been really great. I live in Detroit, so there's changes from the last 40 years have, there's been a lot of losses. So to see so many buildings maintained, it's really great. It's really neat. So a little bit about recommendations now. I do want to say, so these are our recommendations as consultants. None of these are, what you do with this information as a city is, up to you guys, as Carrie was mentioning. So the first one is the boundary clarification. The wording of basically where the boundaries are situated, it just could use some clarification. The one specific example that I would give would be having to do with 310 North Lincoln Street, where the way the boundaries are mentioned, it's actually not clear if that building is in the district or not. It's not contributing, but it would be good to clarify. I think that actually has to do with, if you look at the original maps they used to trace the boundaries, there were two maps that were taped together, and it made it seem that Farrier and High Street were at the same latitude, but they're not, which caused some issue. So a minor issue, but we think should be clarified. Next slide, please. Expanded the period of significance. So originally the district was really focused on 19th century buildings, and then the 1983 survey, and then the National Register nomination that happened later in the 80s, it expanded that period of significance. The National Register nomination was in 1830 to 1938, and we recommend expanding it to 1969. Generally, buildings that are newer are not 50 years old are not really considered historical. There are some extenuating circumstances sometimes, but generally that's a good rule of thumb. But part of the reason why we chose that date is it's the end of Ypsilanti's post-war period of growth, and also these new mentalities kind of arriving in the 1970s of what to do with the city, kind of conflicting mentalities, really. Kind of this more, we should kind of more suburbanize and bulldoze lots of things, build parking lots, things like that. Get rid of some of these old resources. And then the kind of historic preservationist mentality that was like, actually, these are really cool. We should actually try to work to preserving them. And that's why this district was, founded in the late 70s. Groups like the Ypsilanti Heritage Foundation were founded in the 70s. So 1969 we found was a pretty good cutoff point. This does allow us to include some buildings that are contributing of more modern styles, like this was the 300 West Forest, the old Central Elementary School, just one example. Then update the list of contributing and non-contributing resources. So our list is very comprehensive. We didn't just look at the individual buildings on these properties, but also, as I mentioned, the outbuildings. We also looked at sites, structures, and objects. So that includes structures like the bridges, whether they're contributing or not. Sites would be things like parks, and then even some objects that were large enough or we saw as significant enough. Say the Depot Town clock. That was built, I think, in the early 90s. So that is a non-contributing object as one example. But the World War I memorial, that's the north part of Riverside Park, is a good example of an object that would be contributing. So all that has been documented. So comprehensive list. And then reclassify some non-contiguous portions of the Ypsilanti Historic District. We were actually contracted to just survey the core of the district, the contiguous part, but there are certain properties that are not touching, that are further away, like the water tower, for instance. And those, we recommend keeping them probably as historic district, although we didn't survey them, so we can't say for sure. But they should probably be in there, keeping in line with modern practices, they would be their own districts. Amend the boundaries to reflect present conditions. We suggested just one or two boundary increases and a few boundary decreases. The boundary increases, the one would be along just South Adams Street, just maybe a block and a half down to between Woodward and Catherine. This is actually a portion that's considered the southern edition of the district on the National Register, so it would put the districts in line there. And it does have some nice buildings. This is 218 Woodward Street that would certainly be considered contributing if it was in the district, but it is not. Boundary reductions would be, for instance, along the Water Street redevelopment area. There's no historical resources that remain there, so there's really no reason for it to remain in the district. Survey additional areas. There's a few areas that we've kind of suggested that could use more surveying. One would be the south side of Ypsilanti. There's probably quite a number of resources there that, to my knowledge, has never been surveyed. And then to the west of the historic district, what's known as the western addition to the National Register district. All those districts are a bit confusing, but that has been looked at for the National Register, but could use to be surveyed. And there's definitely stuff there too. So we suggested a survey there too. And next slide, please. And the last couple things, nominate individual resources to the National Register of Historic Places. The district itself is nominated, the register, and there's one building that is individually nominated, 218 North Washington, the Ladies Literary Club building. But we have a list of 10 different buildings and, well, in one case, a structure that we suggest are National Register eligible. This would be pending looking at their interiors and doing much more work, but from what we could see, they are probably eligible for the National Register. And then finally, to conduct an intensive level survey of the area we did. We really just looked at, the buildings from the streets, right? And it did some cursory historical research, but there's so much more that could be done in a city. I mean, I visited the Historical Society archives and they have folders on so many individual buildings that we just, because of the scope of this project, we did not have time to look at. But there's so much more there. There's also, it would give an opportunity to do a lot of oral history and ask residents, the history of the place, which just walking around, people would come up to me and first of all, they'd be like, why are you taking pictures of my house? Looking around, and then I'd explain, but a lot of them wanted to share the history of the house, right? Some people one person was like, that house was moved. That's really useful information to know and why it wasn't on early fire insurance maps. Now we have a better date of when it was from. We're talking about, one resident was like, oh, this porch, it looks Queen Anne style, but it's actually not original. We removed the cladding on the back one, found the original porch there, and we used those materials to emulate and build the new front porch. So there's just tons of stuff there that would be, great to do an intensive level survey for. So yeah, those were our recommendations. I don't know if you want to guys just move to questions or
Yeah, so if anyone here has questions about their findings or recommendations, thank you so much for that overview is the perfect length, but also I think we all know there's so much
yeah, and
in
the
the
report's
district.
long, but it's still like, there's still so much.
Yes,
It's one of the
so
neat things with working in the city for sure.
absolutely. Does anyone here have a question? Okay, so if I'm gonna just move this table out here and I'll get you a microphone. So let me set that up really quick so we can record. Okay. So the question was where the report is located on the website. At this moment, it is not up there. And part of that is like the final draft will be uploaded and we're still finalizing that. But on the Historic District webpage, if you scroll down to the bottom, there's historic studies and there's like the, different surveys and it's going to be added to the top there. And that's also eventually where I want to add the individual identification forms so that people can have access to those too. There's a draft for the meeting, but it's in the linked, what's that? Yes, yep. I just wanted to make that available. And actually that was at the suggestion of Steve Pierce, who said, oh, it might be nice to be able to read that going into the meeting so that if there are questions, they're a little bit more informed. So thank you for that suggestion. So I did add the draft in, but the final, yes, we still need our final reviews. Yeah.
Probably won't and hopefully won't change significantly. There's already been several revisions.
Right.
So yeah, it's not gonna change significantly.
Yeah, so end of August, it will for sure be uploaded to the website and available publicly, and it will remain available. Let me check if there are any questions online. If you're online and have a question, we've got a question here, but feel free to ask one, just use the raise hand function.
Online head?
That should be working.
So the question that I have is, and this may not have been in your scope,
Mhm.
but were there properties outside the historic district that we should be looking at saying, oh yeah, that's one we shouldn't ignore?
So part of what we did was, part of the requirement is to kind of look a little bit outside the district boundaries. And that's kind of what we did along, South Adams Street was one place to look at. I think we also recommended along a couple properties along High Street. There's a ton on the west side. That was originally the just west of the district that really could be looked at. And those are mentioned in the National Register report as the Western Edition, it's called. It's actually a separate document, the Western Edition to the Ypsilanti Historic District. That's several hundred properties. So we did not have time to really do any in-depth study of those, but just walking around briefly, definitely there's a ton of stuff there. Those are the kind of the three main areas, which we talk a little bit more in depth in the report itself. Yeah.
Oh,
Did we do what? Sorry.
Did we do forms for any outside the district?
Maybe the high one. I can't remember. I don't think so. Or we have them, but I don't know if we gave them. It's a good question.
I can't remember if we did forms for any buildings outside the district, but if we did, it was like one or two. It was
Yeah,
very,
the high
we
one.
didn't do a lot of looking outside the district.
So part of being a CLG is that you eventually, after you do survey, you also develop a survey plan for kind of incrementally making some progress. Ypsilanti is kind of unique because the district is so large. A lot of other communities have like smaller individual neighborhoods. But that's not how they did it when they did it in the 70s and 80s. And so this covers such a huge part of the city that realistically, it'll be a little while before they probably have the capacity to do any more survey. But part of being a CLG is kind of making this plan and taking this into account and taking the recommendations and saying, okay, well, what could we do? Is there a small, couple of buildings that we could try to get done, or have an intern that could come help? Like there's the expectation for CLGs is that it's kind of a partnership between our office, the National Park Service, and local communities. And Washtenaw County is a CLG. It's the only countywide CLG in the state, but also Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti are their own CLGs. So there's a lot of opportunities in Washtenaw County for funding through the CLG program. We're required to pass through 10% of what our office gets from the federal government to these local communities. Usually it's over that, but that's what we're required as the minimum. So over time, you all could come back for another survey or for designations or for physical work on buildings. I know we've done that in the past. In downtown, I know there was a big signage project a decade or two ago to rehab some of the historic signs in town. And so there's lots of opportunities. Correct. Yep. Yes. Yep. Certified local government program. Nope, that's us. So our office administers the National Register program for the state of Michigan. So the question was whether or not that National Register information is on the city's website. I don't know if your downtown, like your city nomination is on the website. It's on the National Archives website.
Right. Yeah.
All of Michigan's nominations from about 2012 back are on the National Archives website. We also have a publicly accessible portal that you can download and look at reports. And we are working on it's a little complicated right now because it's primarily for consultants that are doing this kind of work, but there will also be at some point kind of a more public facing portion of that where people can have easier access to it. But I don't think the city has them.
No, I believe it's just the local surveys that are posted,
Yeah.
but I'm more than happy to help, point people to where those are located. And yeah, they are helpful to read over.
Yeah, they're very interesting.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So I'm Paul Schreiber. So you mentioned that some of the buildings had the wrong date they were built. How did you determine the date what did you look at first, and how did
So
you?
dating is tough, for sure. It's very hard. The first thing you look at is the physical aspect of the building. Because if you have other dates, you can tell, you're like, well, you know, if this, let's say a lot of dates are available on the city assessor's website. For instance, and it says like, this was built in 1966. And you're like, well, it's a Queen Anne style house, almost certainly built between 1880 and 1910. That's not, it probably moved or something is wrong there. A huge resource was Sanborn fire insurance maps, of which I managed to find 8 different years in Ypsilanti that covered most of the historic district, 1888 on through 1964. So that was super helpful in limiting the dates. Now the assessor's website was still useful. A lot of times they would say some stuff, but oftentimes, especially for older buildings, it didn't really make sense. Or, you know, sometimes they'd have weirdly early ones, like this was built in 1800. And you're like, there was no one was living here at that time. So no, yeah. I mean, the French trader, you know, so it didn't really make sense. So yeah, some of it is you always have to correlate with what you're looking at physically. But it did give us clues to a lot of times. There were quite a few buildings that have been moved, for sure. They just do not appear on the fire insurance maps, even though everything around them changes. And then all of a sudden, boop, they appear. Or sometimes you can even tell, you're like, oh, this is actually this building that got flipped and moved over here. It has the exact same footprint. That's almost certainly it. So some was physical, some was look at fire insurance maps, and then other sources, sometimes there might be just different historical sources that talk about it, you know, using like the Ypsilanti gleaning for sometimes they going into history of individual property with more detail, which is very useful. Someone else has done archival research in the past. But because this is a reconnaissance level survey, I imagine some of those dates are wrong and they could be definitely narrowed down more than what we did. Yeah.
They're on the National Archives website.
A lot of them are, yeah. So almost all, yeah, a lot of them were. One, I think it was the 1938 one was not, but there's a physical copy at the Ypsilanti Historical Society. So there's one year that they had that no one else, that I could not find anywhere else. So that was also useful because that was actually really nice because it was 30, I can't remember the exact date, but it was just before World War II. And then you could kind of compare the changes of what happened right after the war, which was.
And often those fire insurance, like not often, I guess, occasionally they'll even have built 1914.
Yeah, for larger
They'll even
buildings, they'll just tell you
add
the date.
information. Yeah, which is very helpful. But you can search, if you go to the National Archives website or just go on Google and just search National Archives Michigan Sanborn maps, it'll pull them all up. There's, it's not going to be any of the neighborhoods for the most part. It's going to be downtown. Later on, they'll probably get to.
Yeah, even 1888 one it covers downtown. It covers some of the west side neighborhoods and some of the around Depot Town and stuff like that. Excuse me. So yeah, a lot of them do cover quite a bit of the historic district. If you're getting further away on the west or the northwest, for instance, or on the northeast side, that it's going to be in the 1920s starting, I think is the earliest dates there. Which by then a lot of the buildings have been already built, but you can still useful to look at. You can see changes to them too, like the different additions changing. And I tried to note anything significant that I noted when there's a change between the Sanborn maps. I tried to put it in the history section on the individual property forms. So if you are interested in individual property, once we get those finalized, they'll be accessible and you can check those out.
You corrected me though. We think it's the Library of Congress website, not
Yes.
National Archives. The National Register are definitely on the National Archives, but we think it's Library of Congress that has the Sanborns.
No, that's correct. Yeah.
And they are kind of searchable. It's kind of, they've made some improvements in the last few years to where they're a lot easier to use online than they used to be.
Yes.
So
they're also fun just to look at in
Yeah.
person because they're really big, and actually a lot of them have been digitized, but in black and white. But you actually have the color. If you have the original ones that are in color. And I think the latest one, actually, another physical one that I could not find on that website is actually in the planning archives here. So in this building. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So because everybody here cares about facts, copyright laws didn't exist in America until the 1920s. Which is why all the Sanborn maps prior to the 1920s are available online because they're not copywritten. After the 1920s, you can no longer get them for free from the Library of Congress.
Yes, that's very true, which is why I resorted to physical copies
Right.
here where I can find them. Yeah,
Right.
Exactly. It makes research more difficult. But yes, that is.
And that's the reason.
Yep.
So I really want to use my comment section to talk a little bit about a quote recommendation that doesn't get discussed much in preservation circles, something that can take a high toll on old structures, and that is zoning codes. In Southeast Michigan, if you read a zoning code for a non-conforming structure, 100% of the time, everyone I've ever read says if a non-conforming building falls below 50% of its value, you have to take it down. That's our values here. In the back of my house, on a stretch of alley that has 6 houses, 3 on one side, 3 on the other, there are 4 non-conforming structures. However, what's interesting is if you go to New England and read their zoning codes, which I have, they say that when your non-conforming building falls below 50% of its value, you can rebuild it. They encourage you to rebuild it because that's their values. We can write those codes here too. In Ipsy, it says to tear them down. But there are codes. We have done our zoning code, interestingly, something I've never read in a zoning code until I moved here, was in the historic, what's it called? The historic neighborhood corridor. I don't remember the exact name of it, and my house is in it. Interestingly, you can use a house as a bed and breakfast by right. Most beds and breakfasts have to be a PUD, which is a difficult and expensive thing to structure for your property. That's a good thing that's in our code. That helps preserve buildings. It gives building owners an option. What do you do with such a big thing? So I would really encourage the city to read their zoning code from a beta testing point of view to try to figure out, where does this go wrong in historic districts? Because in my work, I find that I'm trying to preserve things, and the zoning code, it breaks my heart when I'm standing in front of a building board of appeals and they say, we love what you're trying to do. It makes perfect sense, but it's not according to our code. Therefore you can't do it. Because they never thought of it before. The idea of moving buildings was common 100 years ago. And when it comes, for example, to agricultural buildings, they almost all have been moved, greater than 50%. Why can't I move them today? Well, because our code, literally our building code, says you can't. If you move them, it has to be completely new. So there are numerous things in our other codes that affect this conversation. And we as professionals should be looking for them and trying to affect change. Thanks.
If I could add, by the way, I'm Josh, I'm the city planner. Our zoning code does actually allow historic structures, that are designated as historic by the HTC to continue nonconformities. That is a specific section in our zoning code. So it is allowed. Now, granted, if you're proposing something new that was not originally there, or it's never there and you have no way to prove that, if it does not conform with the zoning ordinance, then it's not permitted. But if it has always been there and you have proof of it, you're allowed to continue those nonconformities. When it comes to land uses, if you take a residential property and turn it into a commercial property, it will need to go before the planning commission. Every zoning district is different, but there are safeguards in our zoning ordinance that ensures that historic properties are protected and preserved. And it's in our master plan as well. It is encouraged in our master plan, so.
There are some safeguards. They can be intensified. They can be looked at strictly from the point of view of old buildings, where you can say, if that old building existed here, and start putting dates in there. If it's 100 years old, absolutely, we want you to rebuild it. It needs to be more specific, because I've personally been in those battles, not necessarily in the city of Ipsy, where it seems like it's covered, but when a building official feels like they can't, they're sticking their neck out because it's not clear enough, they don't stick their neck out.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you have pictures, if you have proof that there was something there, it can be rebuilt exactly as is. Now, obviously, modern building codes do play a role. Zoning codes cannot impact building codes at the end of the day. And so our zoning code does a lot to ensure preservation of our historic districts. So.
Really glad you're here to be able to answer that question better than I could. My one comment too is, luckily we share an office, which is really nice because we're communicating a lot of things back and forth to each other. So hopefully that will help. It definitely helps me. And I think, especially with Josh going through through Eastern Michigan's historic preservation program, he also has that. We have
We
the
have
same goals.
same goals, yeah.
Yes. So, but thank you for that comment. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead. Just check.
The other thing that I wanted to talk about, again, my name is Steve Pierce, is I was really encouraged by your one of your recommendations to extend the time that we look at as a historic district to 1969. I think that's really valuable. It is something that we are missing here in Ypsilanti, and that was one of the reasons why I was asking, did you look out beyond? Because there are building booms that occurred here in Ypsilanti where a lot of similar architecture and designs were done all at the same time. We look at post-war and the boom in the east side, which was all basically farmland, and very quickly between there, 1953, 54, just blossomed into all new housing. And then the boom that we saw in the late 50s and 60s on the west side. And there are some really spectacular mid-century modern houses over on the west side, Roosevelt and in that area, that are worthy of not only designating and recognizing what they are, because we sort of think of, I mean, we look at our logo and all and what is our traditional historic district, and a lot of people don't think that these mid-century moderns, but they're 50, 60 years old. There's an incredible example of an all-electric house, and it is almost entirely original to its original construction in the early 60s. And there's a couple of others that are just really spectacular. So I'm encouraged by that. It's going to be a difficult process because people are going to go, I don't want I love historic districts, don't make my neighborhood a historic district. So that's always a challenge, but I'm encouraged by that. And I think of in our own downtown district, the Smith Furniture Building, which largely has just not been goofed up, surprisingly, considering all that has gone through. That is largely what it looks like, what it did when it was first built in 1960. And so recognizing that that is a contributing building or should be a contributing building at a very different era. And Josh, you're absolutely right about the protection in the code for that. But where this really is a problem is when it comes down to mortgages, because and this is about non-conforming building in any area, but especially in the historic district. If the current use is a non-conforming use, mortgages are typically more expensive to borrow money. And the best, if you look at what you were describing in your earlier review about what's extraordinary about Ypsilanti is how the properties have been maintained for a long time. It's because owners, whether they lived in them or lived in the community, invested in other properties, kept investing and helping to maintain these properties over years and years and years. And it is a real struggle for a first-time home buyer to come in and get a traditional mortgage on a building that is non-conforming, where that it's not by right that they can rebuild. And so it's a real challenge. And so for me, encouraging people to come invest in the community and to buy a home in the community, especially to buy a multifamily home and work to convert it back to what it originally was a single family. And I encourage folks to do that all the time. You want to buy a house, they're not very much here. They're a lot more than they were a couple of years ago, but buy a 2-unit or a 4-unit. And then as you grow in your career and your family, you can start to claw back one unit, 2 units, and eventually convert it back into a single family home. And that's more about that long-term preservation. But the real struggle is how you borrow money, because there's usually exceptions. Underwriting will look at it and say, it's not rebuilt by right. And so hopefully we can look at some of those things. But I'm thrilled that you were talking about mid-century modern. Thank you. I think it's really important.
It's interesting too that, when you look at like the downtown facades where, a lot of them have been removed and now the buildings are more in line with their historical appearance in the 19th century when they're originally built. However, the few that remain now, what do you know, it's kind of, they are a symbol of a certain time in Ypsilanti's history of its, post-war growth. So it's, do you want to keep that? Do you want to remain, buildings like the Terry Bakery and be like, this is an example of what happened then, even though it's not the original appearance, but it's still really, it shows you something, an important part of the city's history.
Way you could do additional surveys would be to do a thematic survey where you look at modern resources specifically. We've had a lot of communities in the state do that, where they just look at resources built between 1940 and 1970. And that might be, like, thematic surveys might be a good way for you all to kind of go forward over the next couple of decades, because you've got such a huge chunk already done that you can kind of do these smaller, more thematic approaches to kind of get at specific topics. So.
Any other questions? Let me check mine. Yeah, please do plug.
The SHPO is, it's usually every 5 years, but it's going to go to every, I think, 8 years, is doing a statewide historic preservation plan for the whole state right now. We're in our public participation phase. We will have our next public participation meeting at Wayne County Community College in Detroit on the 7th of August. So encourage anybody that's interested to come out and give us some feedback and let us know kind of what is important to you. It's really important that we get as kind of a broad of reach. There's also virtual meetings. You can find more info on our website, which is, it's just michigan.gov/SHPO, SHPO. It's a really great opportunity to kind of give us some feedback and help kind of guide the work that we do, because we don't want to just be there trying to decide what to do. We want to hear from people in the state on what's important to them. So just a thought to continue participation.
Thanks, Katie. All right, any other questions before we wrap up? Or comments? Okay. Thank you, everyone. It was really, very helpful to see everything outlined and hear some of your comments. And you will be hearing more about, the projects that will be stemming from this. And like Katie was talking about, the plan. And I just want to note that Katie touched on this. The city does have a limited capacity, and whatever does come out of the survey, it will immediately be very helpful. But any large projects that come out of the survey will likely take a few years, and funds will need to be, funding will need to be in place for that to happen. But there are a lot of other things that can happen immediately too. I don't think it was just touched on, but there is the state historic tax credit program, and for any building that's contributing to the local or national register historic districts do have the possibility to apply for those tax credits for any, I believe correct me if I'm wrong, any work over 1,500?
For residential?
For residential, but there are also small commercial, large commercial.
Yeah, so the state, so there's a federal tax credit that's existed for a really long time. And then there's the state credit came back in 2022, 2023. Are we in our second or third year? I don't remember. It disappeared in 2011 with a whole slew of other tax cuts. And then we fought really, really hard to bring it back, because it's a really great investment in our kind of built environment and our communities. And the way that the legislature divided it up is that there is a pot for each of those things. There's a pot for residential homeowners. There's a pot for small commercial, medium commercial, and large commercial. The Michigan Historic Preservation Network, which is our kind of nonprofit arm, is working on getting some legislation passed to expand that, which would create more money available to homeowners. But there's usually the large commercial I think those are already reserved through because it's such a small pot of money. I think those are already reserved through the end of next year or the year after that. But the residential, there's always space. So we're happy to help. And one thing that we can do is that we can, if there's interest in the community, we can come in and have one of our architects do a workshop with homeowners to talk about how to apply and what it requires, and how you can make it work for you.
Yes.
It is. Yeah. Well, and that's the kind of feedback that we need, because when they recreated this credit, they didn't really, I mean, they asked us, but they didn't really ask us. And so the way that the rules were written, we were very kind of, we had very specific parameters, and we tried to do our best to make things as accessible as we can. But that's definitely the kind of feedback that we need, because then we can take that, when we hear that, we can take that to the legislature and say, hey, this is what we're hearing. We're hearing that these rules that you set for us are too difficult. How can we help people? Yeah. Yeah. It can be challenging, that's for sure.
Yes, and I just want to mention too, like, because my home is in the Western Addition National Register Historic District, and I was unaware when we bought the property that it was, and I think a lot of um, residents in that area are also unaware. So when Ellen had previously sent out the postcard letting us know, like, oh, your home has been like potentially or identified as contributing, and potentially you'd be able to receive tax credits for rehabilitation. That was confusing to a lot of my neighbors, because that's not well communicated that that's available to those National Register historic districts, because we talk so much about and highlight the local historic district. And so that's just something I want to throw out there again. And I will be revisiting that. I'm going through that process personally. So I totally understand it can be onerous, especially as a homeowner. It can be very worth it for a large rehabilitation project. But maybe parsing out the webinar we have, like kind of a step by step, in breaking it down to make it not so onerous, is definitely something I I hope to do. And so yeah, Katie. Thank you so much for your input and insight on all of that. I'm very happy that you're able to attend. Any other comments before we close up for the evening? Yes, yeah, there's a lot available.
There's also other websites, like newspapers.com is a really great one. It's very fun to look through. And it's not terribly expensive to get a subscription, especially if you only need it for a short period of time. Oh yeah, okay, great. That is great. Yeah.
I just realized we weren't using the microphone for anybody listening to the recording or online.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, what was your name? Wendy? Okay. So Wendy was making a comment that there was recently a workshop that the previous preservation planner, Ellen Thackeray, had co-hosted over at the Freight House a little over a year ago. in May. Yeah, and there were several, there was a session on how to perform property research, and we still have that guide available. So definitely, if any of you have questions, and I failed to, there's my contact information. I also have my cards out. So please feel free to take a card or contact me if you're, researching a property, you have any questions about the survey report, when things will be available, where they're at. I'll make sure, one of the things that I will be doing is sending out a mailing to everyone within the local historic district to make sure that they have access to, the documentation and just a brief summary so they know where to access everything. So if you're within the historic district, you'll be receiving that probably early September after things are finalized. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate you coming out. And yeah, hopefully we'll have more soon.